the Dashboard Effect Podcast. I'm Rick Thompson.
And I'm Caleb Oakes.
Caleb, we wanted to take some time just to go through some common terms from the data world that you and I throw out all the time. Yeah. And there are probably some of our listeners who may not be familiar with some of them, especially if they're new to data and they're coming to us to learn about it. So for this episode and maybe a couple after, we'll just go through some of these.
Yeah. Hindsight, probably should have done this about 56 episodes ago, but better late than never.
That's all right. We can keep referring back to it.
Right.
All right. So some of this will be basic for some of our listeners, but I think it'll be helpful. So why don't we start with sort of at the level of the database. When we talk about a transactional database, what are we talking about?
So that's a database that you transact against, right? So when I say transact, that means like you're inputting data. You're making something happen against the database. So a really common example is if you go to the grocery store, as you're scanning items across the scanner, that's a transaction. You could say the transaction is actually buying the groceries, but let's say you scan a product, it transacts against the database somewhere to say this product was scanned, right? That's a transaction. So it's something that people use in the world to keep track of information.
Yeah, okay. You can almost think of it like the back end of business software that's tracking data, like CRM, so tracking sales data or prospect data, or, as you said, a grocery store transaction. That's perfect. Okay, so why wouldn't every database be a transactional database? What other kind do you have?
Yeah. So first of all, there's a ton of transactional databases out there. There is a lot. And it used to be that's all there was, right?
Yeah.
But as people started to want to consume that data and look at it and like aggregate it and visualize it, basically everything we do, you needed a different type of database to be able to support that well. So that's where we get into what we would call an analytical database, or what might be referred to as an OLAP. We don't really use that term anymore. It's kind of old school.
It's pretty old. It's kind of wonky. It is kind of cool.
Yeah, right. If you want to impress your friends, you say OLAP. And the other one we would call an OLTP, right?
Yeah, so online transaction processing database, OLAP, online analytics processing database.
Yep, right.
Okay. And so what's the difference between an OLAP and an OLTP?
So good question. So the OLAP is going to take some of those. How can I explain this simply? So when let's say you go to the grocery store, when you go to scan like an apple, the way that database, the transactional database is set up is it's likely going to have a table for items. It's going to have a table for colors. It's going to have a table for whatever else describes that item, because the transaction, if you need to transact against things, you need to touch as little data as you possibly can, right? So you want to really fragment your database as much as you can. But then when we try to report on it, we want to like pull it all back together. So
that it performs well.
Because exactly. We're doing aggregations and stuff over it, not single transactions against it.
Yeah.
So we're looking at bunches of transactions at once. So we need to like do some transformations to get fewer tables. It's the simplest way to think about it. If you got a lot of tables in your OLTP, you want not so many tables in your OLAP. So that your analytical tools don't have to go to so many tables to pull the information together. Yeah.
Okay. Exactly. So we didn't have these terms, but we might as well define them. So there's normalization of a database, which is fragmenting it, and it's a term people might hear of third normal form, where you fragmented to an optimal amount. So, for example, if you have an address database, you might have a state separate table for states that you refer to from your address with a foreign key, which we'll talk about, that can give you the state name and maybe the region it's in, the definition that you'd use when you're using an address, those types of things.
Right.
Denormalization is going the other direction.
Exactly, right. You would want to take that state and put it on the address table.
Yeah.
When you denormalize it.
And then it'll perform really quickly for your analytics work.
Exactly.
May not be the most efficient from a space standpoint, but it serves the purpose. Okay, great. So while we're talking about that, what is SQL? SQL.
Yeah, good. First of all, let's clear this up. If you're working with a developer and they call it SQL, you got a bad developer. It's SQL.
They're new.
SQL. Yeah, they're new. They're still learning. Right. So it stands for Structured Query Language. Essentially what it is, it's a way for you to interact with a database, like pull information back from a database. So you're writing queries, which we'll get to in a second, but you write some code, you run the code against the database, and it will go to the database tables that you've put into your SQL query, and it will pull data back. So it's the code. That's actually kind of not completely accurate. It's commonly, when someone says they use SQL, it's commonly referred to as the code.
Yeah.
There are other uses for that term, but
yeah,
that's probably
it is code. It's a very specialized kind of code.
Yeah.
So how would you? No,
I don't know. You could say like SQL Server. Sometimes people just say, "Is this on SQL?" And that means it's a SQL Server database.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, that's true.
So it's used in a lot of different ways.
T-SQL, which is Microsoft SQL Server version of SQL.
Yeah. If you say T-SQL, well, that's a good point, because if you say T-SQL, that's the code. That's transact structure.
Yeah.
SQL, structured query language. So that is actually a code language.
And other people use SQL like MySQL. Ooh, weird name there.
Yeah, right. MySQL.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And Snowflake has their own SQL.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of them.
Yeah, right, exactly. So anyway, I guess the bottom line is it's typically referring to a language, but it can refer to other things.
Okay. Yeah. So what's a query then?
Query. Yeah, a query. So, if we were in the UK, query would be like a question, I like to think about it this way. So you're really kind of asking a question of your database. Like, give me this information, and it gives you information backwards. So you can think of it as a question that you're asking a database.
And you write the question in T-SQL or SQL.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. So we've used the term a bunch in here the last few weeks because we're doing some work on Azure. Serverless SQL. What is serverless SQL?
Serverless SQL. So when we talk about like a standard database, SQL Server database, let's just say that, there is a physical database and a physical engine, like that, or it's software, but it sits on your hardware, and the data is stored inside of a database. It's like a proprietary tool, and when you write a query against that database, it uses the engine, queries the proprietary tables, and pulls back information.
Right.
When we're talking about serverless, it's like, maybe here's a better way to describe it. In that scenario, you've got your storage engine and your compute engine, which actually runs the code against your data, together. It's like packaged into one. So it's a SQL Server, right? When you talk about serverless, you're essentially decoupling those. So now you've got your storage, which a lot of times is a data lake.
Right.
And then you've got your compute, which is your query engine that actually goes and queries data from your data lake in this example. Right. That would be what we refer to when we call something serverless SQL, is just that compute layer. So it does not have storage attached to it.
So you can write your SQL queries the way you normally have and get a result. It'll pull data out of, say, a data lake. You're basically using SQL without using the back end of a SQL Server.
Yeah, right.
The storage part.
Right.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. That's right.
All right. Okay. I think we're out of time. So I think we'll wrap this for now, and we'll come back and do another episode of this if people find it useful. That was great. I felt like I was just like you were on a game show or something.
Yeah, I was feeling like all my blood's rushing to my brain. Well, that's a lot of deep thinking.
That was good. All right. Talk to you next time.
All right. See ya.